Hello. In continuing our look at issues in applied ethics, we're going to be taking a look at Ruth Cigman's article, Death, Misfortune, and Species Inequality, which we're using here as a kind of reply to Alistair Norcross's Puppies, Pigs, and People. And here's our author. This is Ruth Cigman. She received her PhD from Cambridge, and she's currently a professor at University College in London. The article in question, Death, Misfortune, and Species Inequality, was published in 1981. A great amount of literature concerning animal rights really followed a very famous piece by Peter Singer called Animal Liberation, and for sort of decades after that fact, a lot of what Singer introduces has really driven the discussion, and that includes the term speciesism, right, which Cigman describes very early in the paper in order to sort of, take a kind of position or to make a distinction between a number of different claims with regard to speciesism. Speciesism itself is just exactly what it sounds like, right? It's the idea, it's the analog of racism or sexism or ageism or any other kind of an ism in that sense, except using species as a morally relevant category instead of race or sex or age, etc. And so she wants to make a distinction between the weak claim of animal equality and what she calls the strong claim of animal equality. Now, I should say at this point that it's really easy to misunderstand this. Sometimes when, especially authors in philosophy, use the term strong or weak, they don't necessarily mean strong in the sense of good or weak in the sense of bad, right? What they mean is that a weak claim doesn't claim as much, right? It's not as ambitious a claim, or as a strong claim claims a lot, right? It's a more ambitious claim. So we mean weak or strength in that sense, not weak or strong as in sort of good or bad. And if you sort of keep that in mind, this makes more sense right at the beginning of the article. So here's what Cigman says about the weak claim. She says, the weak claim, which I accept, is that we should treat many animals better than we do, and take whatever steps are necessary to oppose certain cruel practices toward them. So right off the bat, we're going to note that there's a substantial amount of overlap or agreement between Norcross's position, which is very much aimed at gratuitous cruelty of animals, and Cigman's view here, which is going to be talking primarily about the issue of death, which is an issue that Norcross didn't really address in a lot of directness in his article. And so in a lot of ways, this article will be sort of focusing on something that Norcross didn't necessarily focus on, and broadly agreeing with at least some of what he claims. The contrast here will be with the strong claim of animal equality, which I think it's probably fair to say that Norcross probably would accept. Cigman puts it this way. She says, the stronger claim is that as women and blacks should have rights equal to those of men and whites, animals should have rights equal to those of persons because differences of species do not constitute a morally relevant difference. My view is that the stronger claim is sentimental and confused. So her argument here is with the stronger claim rather than the weak claim. So though she is going to agree with a substantial amount of things that Norcross says, to the extent that Norcross would accept this stronger claim, that's where Cigman will disagree, and of course would disagree with others who would accept the strong claim. In order to do that, what she is going to do is going to lay out right at the beginning, or now toward the beginning, this the basis for something's having rights. Right? She says this way. She says, I want to suggest that a right to X entails the right to be protected from certain actions which will result in the misfortune or possible misfortune of not X. A condition for being the subject of a right is therefore the capacity to be a subject of the corresponding misfortune. Right? And so although she's focusing here on rights, it's going to be really easy to think of this as a kind of rights-based approach, and that's, you know, not too bad to start with. But you'll notice that when she talks about rights, the only kind of rights she's talking about are the kinds of rights not to be harmed or not to be subject to certain misfortunes. And so Cigman's seems also to be a fairly consequentialist approach to morality, right along with Norcross's. And so one of the main issues that we're going to be spending a lot of time on in this particular article is about a right not to be killed, right? Otherwise known as a kind of negative right to life. These are the steps of reasoning that Cigman is going to take here, right? She again presents a series of claims, right? The first claim that she labels claim 1, she says, we have an obligation not to inflict gratuitous suffering on animals. Claim 1 is sufficiently vague to be self-evidently true, or at any rate, not hard to defend. Right, and I think most people share that intuition, right? That it's not hard to defend the idea that we should not be gratuitously cruel toward animals, right? That's fairly uncontroversial. The second claim, though, right? She says, claim 2 is we have an obligation not to kill animals quickly and painlessly. Claim 2, which is more interesting, I believe to be false. And she continues, I shall proceed on the assumption that it is possible to kill an animal quickly and painlessly. The moral significance of such a death may then be considered. Right? Again, this is the little space she's going to carve out specifically about the issue of death. Now, before we start talking a lot about death, there's a certain kind of a mistake that we ought to head off at the pass. Right? And this is the fallacy of the appeal to ignorance. So a lot of what is going to follow is going to center around what kinds of experiences and mental states and various kinds of mental capacities humans and animals are capable of. And any discussion of that kind is of course going to be fraught with certain kinds of uncertainty. Right? For example, we don't precisely know a lot of things, right, about what life is like for one kind of a creature or another, or even for other human beings. But there, and there's a certain amount that we can and sort of can't appeal to that sort of lack of knowledge about. And so we have to talk a little bit about the appeal to ignorance, which is a kind of fallacy, right? An appeal to ignorance is essentially when you say, well, we don't know that X, therefore, X, right? Or we don't know that not X, therefore X is really the idea. So if you don't know that something isn't the case, then maybe you should think it is, right? Or just because you don't know something is the case, it must not be, right? I mean, that's, again, a kind of fallacy. And basically, it's the fallacy of believing that a lack of proof of one thing is evidence for its opposite, right? And that's not the case. A lack of proof of one thing is not evidence of its opposite. And so it is true that we don't precisely know what non-human animals feel, how they experience the world, what their inner lives are like. We don't know. By the same token, we also do not know precisely what other human beings feel. Okay, that is something that is not accessible to us, right? You only assume they feel more or less like you do, or feel anything at all for that matter. We also do not know what rocks feel, and we have absolutely no compunction kicking them, sitting on them, hitting them with rock hammers, etc. Right? We don't feel bad about that at all. We don't even stop to think about it. But of course, do we know that rocks don't experience pain? Do we know that? Of course not. But just because we don't know that they don't experience pain is not any reason to think that they do. Right? And so we want to make sure that as we go through this whole thing, we're not simply committing the fallacy of the appeal to ignorance. Instead, what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to do the best we can with the evidence that we do have. In fact, that's what we do on a daily basis. So an argument that asks us to assume that animals experience the full range of experiences that you do, just in case you're right about that, is unreasonable, right? We could not credit that usage of the cautionary principle with respect to cars, rocks, trees, etc. So this is an argument you may have heard before. The idea is like, well, what if, right? Animals really did experience every bit of the world, just every bit as, colorfully and, with the same amount of, intellectual clarity as you or I do, right? Look, again, for all we know, they do. But we don't know anyway that they don't. But we can't saying, well, look, just in case, right? Just in case they really do, you should treat them very, very well, or give them equal rights to humans or something like that. It takes the cautionary principle too far and bases too much on an appeal to ignorance, on what we just don't know. After all, if somebody says, you should be really careful, don't curse at your car when it doesn't start, and, don't beat the steering wheel, and, don't do stuff like that because you don't know that the car doesn't have an emotional inner life, right? And just in case it does, you want to make sure you don't treat it in certain ways. Again, if you're not going to buy that argument for a car, a rock, or a tree, then we have the same reason for not necessarily buying it with respect to animals or even other human beings, frankly. So again, it's not just, you can't just base the cautionary principle and this appeal to ignorance on, or you can't base the argument on this cautionary principle and appeal to ignorance. Ultimately, what we have to work with is that we have to infer the approximate character of any non-human animal's experience in the same way that we infer what the experience of other humans is like, right? And we do this by a kind of rough behavioral analogy, which is, likely to be more accurate the more similar to us the animal in question is. And that's not because this is some kind of human-centric argument or something like that. That's just the way analogical reasoning works. When the two things you're comparing are more like one another, the analogy is stronger and makes more sense than when the two things you're comparing are less like one another. That's just basic analogical reasoning there. So the idea is this. The reason why we don't think that rocks experience pain is because they don't behave in any of the ways that we could ever plausibly associate, pain with. They don't try and avoid things that cause pain. They don't recoil from them. They don't make any, spontaneous sounds. They just, they don't behave in any way that's at all recognizable. Whereas animals do. Right. And so we're very confident that animals experience pain because when the kinds of things that happen to us that cause us physical pain happen to them, they react in very similar ways. They make a noise. They try and withdraw. They, try and avoid the thing that caused the pain. They, they will yelp or make another sort of a noise, just like we will. Right. So the idea is that if they're sort of reacting more or less the same way we would when a certain thing happens to them, we can infer that it must feel to them like it feels to us, or something comparable. That's the kind of evidence we have, and so we're just going to have to use that evidence to the best of our ability, because that's really the only thing we've got. The alternative is just accepting a kind of solipsist position where the only thing you know is that you exist. You can't be sure of anything else, or something like that. And so let us then ask the question, what misfortunes are animals capable of suffering? Certainly, pain is one of those, right? And Cigman's going to acknowledge this straightforwardly, right? She puts it this way, if one thinks with Bentham that all the good and bad things that can happen to one in life are quantities of pleasurable and painful experience, the comparison between animal and human misfortune will appear quite reasonable. Right? And that's a pretty astute observation. Remember, Bentham is a hedonist, a very classical, quantitative hedonist, right? He thinks that the only thing that really is ultimately good is pleasure. The only thing that's ultimately bad is pain. And so, and pleasures are all pleasure. Pleasure is what it is. The only thing that makes one thing better than another is the quantity of pleasure that comes with it. All pleasures are qualitatively similar. And so again, if both humans and animals, simply have the capacity for experiencing pleasures and pains, well then it seems like giving them exactly equal rights would sort of make sense under that sort of perspective. Well, Cigman doesn't quite share that perspective. And in order to illustrate that, she's going to bring up the concept of death as a misfortune. And in fact, one of the things that's very interesting about this, a position like Bentham's, which again may well be shared by, for example, Singer, another famous utilitarian advocate of animal equality, and Norcross, who we've already seen. She says this. She says, for the classic utilitarian, death, as opposed to dying, is not a misfortune at all, for it involves no unpleasant experience, but rather an absence of experience. In fact, this view is part of a famous argument by Lucretius to the effect that the fear of death grows out of an irrational conception of death as a state in which we endure, in which the loss of life is in some sense experienced. Lucretius argues that death is not experienced at all, for it is complete annihilation. Therefore, there is no subject for whom death can be a misfortune, and hence death is not a misfortune at all. So that's one of the things. If you really do think that all there is to a good life is sensation, right? Then death itself is neither good nor bad because it's not any kind of a sensation at all. It doesn't feel like anything, presumably, to be dead, or at least the dead give us no evidence that it feels like anything to be dead. And so, one of the things that's really interesting about this is that again, if this is a position that the classical utilitarian would have to accept, then it does go at odds with a pretty common idea. We do pretty commonly think of death as a misfortune, but of course it's an interesting philosophical question. Why? What is it about death that actually makes it a misfortune? So let's take a closer look at this Lucretian position here. This idea that death is not a misfortune at all. And so here's how it goes. The position is that death is not a misfortune because, again, it is the absence of any sensation. And on a worldview that says that sensation is all there is to, good or bad, a position like Bentham's, for example, then, again, death cannot be a misfortune because there's no sensation involved. And so another part of the Lucretian position is that in order for something to be bad, it has to be bad for someone, right? Which again sounds completely reasonable. And of course, when one is dead, there no longer exists anyone for whom something can be bad or good, right? And so that's that sort of second part of the Lucretian position. And this is a fairly common position in the ancient world. In fact, the famous hedonist Epicurus, again, hedonism is the view that what makes a life a good one is that it has more pleasure in it and less pain in it. Again, it's one of these views that says that the only thing that really matters is sensation. And so Epicurus, a famous hedonist, says this in his letter to Menoetius. He says, "Death is nothing to us, since while we exist, our death is not. And when our death occurs, we do not exist." Right? So he's stating the Lucretian position that in order for something to be bad, it has to be bad for someone, and when you're dead, there's no one for whom death can be bad, and so it's not bad. Right? But again, we tend to think of death as a misfortune, and so the question is, what gives? Right, and so this is where it might seem like the middle of the article goes through a bit of a digression, but it's pretty necessary to answer this question at this point. What actually makes death a misfortune for us? So this, if you're curious, in the background here is a gravestone because it's emblematic of death. And it's the gravestone of, you can probably read the name on there, a famous philosopher by the name of Ludwig Wittgenstein, who is in fact quoted at some length in Cigman's article. You might notice that there's some decoration there. There's a little tiny ladder that was left there. This is a reference to one of Wittgenstein's two published works of philosophy. It was his first book called the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, a very imposing title for a very imposing, though fairly short book. And in any case, there's a sentence in there which says something about the words in the book being a little bit like a ladder, which after you've climbed up, to somewhere with it, you can sort of cast it off, and you don't need it anymore. You've already, you can sort of do away with it behind you. And I think somebody was moved in some ways by that passage and left a little bit of a ladder there as just a little token for those who otherwise would come to see this particular grave. Anyway, the question here, right, is in what way is death a misfortune for us? Cigman's going to make use of a couple of famous perspectives on this question. One of those is by this fellow here, a fellow by the name of Thomas Nagel. And the account that Cigman's going to make use of is found in a pretty influential article on the topic of death. It was the article is called Death, right? I think I mentioned before, philosophers are really good at naming things. So if you write an article about death, you may as well just call it Death. And it's worth reading. So if you get a chance to sort of look it up, it's a pretty interesting piece. And so one of the things that Nagel does something that seems fairly commonsensical when you really reflect on it. So he rejects the idea that misfortune has to be experienced as such, right? So the idea is that something can be very unfortunate or even tragic for you, even if you don't necessarily experience it as a misfortune. That is, even if it does not necessarily cause you any kind of pain. Right. And so one example he gives of this among many is he imagines that, somebody who was really seriously betrayed, right, maybe by a very good friend of theirs, but they were unaware of the betrayal. Right. So you might imagine that, something like, Caesar being betrayed by his friend Brutus, right? But he doesn't realize that it was Brutus who delivered him into this sort of ambush by his enemies or something like that. Et cetera, right? I mean, you can again imagine these sort of famous cases of betrayal, whereas, where the person who was betrayed was never aware of it, right? So you might say that kind of a betrayal is certainly a tragedy or a misfortune, but it's not necessarily experienced as such if the person never actually comes to find out about it or know about it or something like that. And so again, you can probably think of a lot of examples yourself of something that might count as something that would make a person's life go worse, and yet that they wouldn't necessarily be, sort of experienced as a misfortune. In addition to that, he uses another example that I think is worth mentioning, is a person who suffers a very serious brain damage in an accident. Right. So the idea is he sort of describes this person, says, hey, they're like maybe a professor of something, right? Maybe philosophy, right? And they, suffer a serious brain injury in an accident, and they have some brain damage as a result. And so, of course, their professional life is over. They, he says, after the accident, the person is, essentially, very simple-minded, seems good-natured and pleasant, right? Seems to be having a fine time of things. But is certainly very much diminished in terms of their mental capacity from what they were before. And the point is that this person who suffers a kind of accident like this, it seems like we would regard it as a kind of misfortune or a kind of tragedy. Because even though they're incapable of understanding after the brain damage what they have lost, it's still a tragedy that they have lost it. Right. And the analogy with death here is pretty clear, right? So even if you can't, while you're dead, regard it as tragic that you're dead, before you die, you can conceptualize the kind of tragedy of moving from a state of not being dead to a state of being dead, right? And you can conceptualize a movement from one condition to another as a kind of tragedy before it happens. Right, just in the same way that you can imagine a kind of injury that causes this kind of damage as a kind of tragedy even before it happens, and even though after it happens you wouldn't be able to any longer conceptualize it as a tragedy. Right, so it's a really, really interesting example that I think gets at what Cigman is going for here. So Cigman suggests that one must have that kind of capacity, the capacity to conceptualize this move from one condition to another as a tragedy in order for death to be a tragedy, right? So if you're the kind of being that is never capable of thinking of the, moving from a state of existing to a state of not existing as a kind of tragedy in the way that you can think of moving from a state of having your full mental faculties to no longer having your full mental faculties as a tragedy, is a kind of necessity for having that actually be that sort of misfortune to you, right? So that's a kind of thing that Cigman's looking for here. And it's a thing that she's going to end up suggesting that human beings do have this capacity by and large, and animals, as far as we can tell, we have, with all the evidence that we could even charitably interpret, don't have that relevant capacity. She's going to continue, and in fact, Cigman herself really, I think, prefers Williams's account of death as a misfortune to Nagel's, even though both of them really sort of add to and make the kind of point that she's looking for here. This is Bernard Williams. I didn't put his first name in there on the slide there. That's Bernard Williams. He's a famous philosopher in ethics. And in one of his essays in a book called Problems of the Self, which was published in 1973, he argues that it's the possession of what he calls a categorical desire. And this, I should just say, is not necessarily to be confused with anything like a categorical imperative. It's not a use of the word categorical in the same way that Kant uses it. Nobody uses language in exactly the same way that Kant uses it. But that's an exaggeration, but still. So anyway, a categorical desire for Bernard Williams is a desire that provides a reason to continue living, right? And so the idea is, if you, say, for example, have this desire to be, a great concert pianist or something like that, that you're working toward that thing, that having a desire like that, and say, being able to conceptualize death as being something that would prevent you from accomplishing that desire or prevent you from pursuing it. He says that's the kind of desire that the kind of desire that, again, makes life worth living, really. And it's having some of those and thinking of death as an interruption of that before it happens is what makes death a misfortune to us. That's what makes us think of death as a bad thing, even though when you're dead, you don't desire anything anymore, right? Or again, the dead give us no evidence that they desire anything. So Cigman puts it this way, or actually, she quotes Williams here. This is a quote from Williams. So Williams says, "To want something is to that extent to have a reason for resisting what excludes having that thing. And death certainly does that for a very large range of things that one wants. One who has these categorical desires has reason to regard possible death as a misfortune to be avoided, and we, looking at things from his point of view, would have reason to regard his actual death as a misfortune." Right. So again, Cigman is going to focus on this notion of being able to conceptualize death in a certain way as a necessary requirement for death to count as a misfortune for anybody, not just for us. But also, she wants to say that's what explains why death is a misfortune for us, why we do think of it that way. So she gives us a kind of, I apologize for the length of this quote, but I'm going to go ahead and go through it anyway because it really does very solidly encapsulate her view. And here it is on page 59. Cigman writes, "One can only understand life and death in these ways if one possesses the related concepts of long-term future possibilities, of life itself as an object of value, of consciousness, agency and their annihilation, and of tragedy and similar misfortunes. It is only by an imaginative leap that possession of these concepts seems attributable to animals as well as to persons. This leap is all the more tempting and therefore all the more dangerous because it's not obviously absurd. It's certainly the case, for example, that some animals experience emotions of a relatively sophisticated nature, and that these emotions involve a kind of recognition of such things as human misfortune, impending danger to another, potential loss, and so on. I see no reason to withhold the ascription of sympathy, anxiety, even grief to some animals. I only want to deny what may be suggested by an anti-speciesist, that these emotions and the range of awarenesses which they presuppose give us a way into legitimately ascribing to animals an understanding of the finality and potentially tragic significance of death. Such understanding is necessary for a subject of categorical desires. Right. I think this is a very nuanced position here that Cigman is taking, and it's worth really thinking about it and sort of reading over this passage carefully several times. So, I mean, go ahead and pause here or go back to the original article and really take a look at this and the surrounding context very carefully. So again, what she's not going to do, she's not trying to paint this picture that says, the way that that some have accused Kant of saying, that animals are basically just rocks, or certainly not the way Descartes in fact says that animals are just little machines, right? That there's nobody home, they don't actually feel anything, etc. This is not Cigman's position. Right. Cigman says, of course, it seems obvious that at least some animals do have some kinds of, significant emotional range, right? She just doesn't think that it extends to some very specific cognitive capabilities. That is, the ability to recognize the idea of the finality of death prior to its happening, and to recognize that as a kind of interruption of the plans that one has that make life worthwhile. Right? So you actually says you really have to think about it in that way in order for death to be a misfortune to you. And in general, human beings do that, and we have, according to Cigman here, really very little evidence for saying that animals do go that far, even if they do have some degree of emotional range, more or less depending on the animal. So I like to think of Cigman's argument as I like to think of this analogy, right? That helps, I think, to clarify certainly what I think Cigman is up to, right? If you're out there, Dr. Cigman, and you think I'm totally wrong, please reply to the video. But here's what I think is somewhat similar to what's going on here, in the sense that describes the differences of our duties toward other human beings and the differences, between the duties we have to other human beings and the duties that we have to various non-human animals. And so the analogy is going to center around this critter here that you see photographed. That is Ludwig, my cat. In a strange twist of coincidence, this cat is in fact named after Ludwig Wittgenstein, the fellow whose gravestone is showed earlier and who is quoted at length in this article. Of course, that's not such a huge coincidence. That, I mean, Wittgenstein was a pretty famous, pretty influential philosopher. It's hard to find a lot of places where he's not referenced in some way or shouldn't be. But anyway, that's the case here. And so that's Ludwig. That's my cat. He's as of the recording of this video, about 15 years old and still doing pretty good. In any case, this is he, and you'll notice some of his features here. You'll notice the sort of let me get my laser pointer out, and notice he won't chase this one. It's just a photograph of a cat. If he were an actual cat, he would chase this all over. So anyway, he's got like the whole little sort of perfect little white triangle. He looks like he's wearing socks. You can't really see his rear feet, but he's got sort of the little white boots on the rear feet too. So he very much does look like he is wearing a tuxedo. I mean, lots of times black and white cats are referred to as tuxedo cats, but this is a tuxedo cat. I mean, there's a reason why the only Halloween costume we've ever put him in is just a little sort of bow that goes around the neck. It's a little bow tie. It's black, and of course it just completes the whole tuxedo image. Yeah, so he does absolutely. It looks like he's wearing. Now, I use this fact as sometimes I confess, I sometimes mock his appearance. Right? I will sometimes refer to him instead of by his name as Professor Silly Mittens or something like that, just because it seems funny to me. Sometimes I'll ask him questions. I'll say, boy, what are you all dressed up for? All dressed up and nowhere to go, or boy, what's the occasion? Sometimes I'll snap my fingers, garçon, as if he's some sort of a waiter in a tuxedo, right? Stuff like that, right? You just sort of, it's like, hey, where's the symphony conductor? Where are you off to? Things. It's like again, it's a thing I do fairly often, right? I kind of enjoy it. And notice mockery is, in order for mockery to be a kind of misfortune for you, you have to be capable of certain kinds of cognitive performances, right? You have to be able to have some appreciation of social standing, of irony, of a subtle dig, and so that's I've no evidence that my cat is capable of any of the kind of cognitive sophistication necessary. I mean, as cats go, I think he's pretty intelligent, but it comes nowhere close to being able to appreciate anything like the nature of mockery. And so the only reason I think it's allowable to mock his appearance. Anyways, I don't think I have any moral duty not to mock him. The only reason I do that is because I think he's incapable of conceptualizing mockery as a misfortune. Right? And again, maybe I'm wrong about that, but again, we don't want to fall into this sort of appeal to ignorance here. Again, the best evidence we have indicates that it's pretty unlikely, right, that he can conceptualize verbal mockery. I mean, even nonverbal mockery, like if I'm, folding the laundry, sometimes I'll put socks on my hands and just sort of stare at him in exactly the same way that he's staring at me, and he'll just keep staring at me, right? I think he thinks, I don't know what he thinks about the situation, but he certainly doesn't read the level of, sort of even, physical mockery going on there. Again, I don't think he's got the cognitive wherewithal for that. I do think he has at least some of the kinds of emotional lives that many other mammals have, especially sort of your more complex mammals. But yeah, this one I don't think is there, right? Again, this is too specifically cognitive. I, however, do think that other human beings, especially adult human beings, fully understand the significance and fully are able to conceptualize mockery, which is why I would never, right, make fun of the appearance of another human being. Right. So, just imagine I, walk into class and start making fun of what my students are wearing. I just know, right. They're quite capable of should absolutely take offense to that sort of thing. And so again, so that kind of example is I think what Cigman is up to here. Right, in pointing out these differences of being able to conceptualize something as that being a kind of necessary condition for that type of thing being a misfortune for some person or non-human animal. And because humans, certainly ordinary adult humans, are capable of conceptualizing those things, we have duties toward adult human beings that we do not have toward animals who cannot conceptualize those sorts of things. I think that's essentially what Cigman is up to. And if you substitute, this idea of not being able to conceptualize death for the idea of not being able to conceptualize mockery, I think that gets us pretty close to what she's suggesting here. And so I should mention at this point that the kind of moral view that Cigman seems to be forwarding here, it's one of, I think it's closest to qualitative utilitarianism. So what we see in terms of disagreement between somebody like Norcross and someone like Cigman is not so much rights versus consequences, because even though Cigman does talk a lot about rights, the only basis for rights that she discusses is a duty not to inflict harm or misfortune. Right, which is a very consequentialist way of looking at things. And so I think it's fair to call her approach, at least in this article, broadly consequentialist. Instead, though, her account of these varying tiers of misfortune very much reminds me of John Stuart Mill's suggestion that some pleasures are of a higher quality. They're in a kind of higher tier than others. And I think the idea that one of the things that Mill suggested about the higher quality pleasures, he says, they're the ones that engage one's higher faculties, right? So for example, a human being is capable of experiencing pleasure of, say, reading Roman poetry or something like that, whereas, a dog, a cat, or a pig is simply not capable of experiencing that kind of pleasure. And so again, he thinks of these pleasure as going in sort of various tiers, where the higher quality pleasures are more valuable, more considerable than these sort of lower quality pleasures of just plain old sensation. Right. And so that's a very deep dispute, right, among utilitarians. It's certainly a big dispute between Bentham, who really did think that all there is to it is quantity of sensation, and Mill, who thought that quality of sensation mattered. It seems like Norcross largely argues only on the quantity of sensation, that is, quantity of pains, and weighing those against various kinds of pleasures. Whereas Cigman seems here to really be trying to make a basis for separating pleasures into various different tiers of quality based on the kinds of capabilities of various different beings. And so at long last, we get to one of the most interesting parts of Norcross's analysis, which was this deployment of the marginal cases argument. Right, because it seems like if you've really been sort of thinking along with this and paying attention, you probably have thought on several occasions, okay, yeah, but what about humans who can't conceptualize certain things, or humans with certain kind of mental disabilities, or infants, or children, or people who are comatose, or all sorts of he's like, do they all of a sudden is death not a tragedy for any of them? After all, we tend to regard it as very tragic when children die, as opposed to when the very elderly do. I mean, certainly no one likes it when someone dies, but it's regarded as a tragedy for a very young person in a way that it doesn't tend to be for a person who has lived a full life. And so, yeah, so you might say, well, what gives Cigman? And if I had any complaints about Cigman's article, this might be one of them. I think she sort of dodges the marginal cases argument in a way that's a little unfortunate. And so remember, the marginal cases argument says that if there's supposed to be some feature that separates humans from animals, right, then there will be at least some animals that have that feature more than some persons, right? And what are you going to do there? And again, especially the candidates for marginal cases are, severely mentally handicapped, adult humans, and also, of course, infants and young children, and the senile and the comatose, etc. Right? What do you do? Right? What do you do there? Are you going to say that they, after all, don't have the right to life because they can no longer conceptualize certain things, or perhaps never were able to in some cases? What do you do? Well, here's how Cigman suggests. We'll go through what Cigman suggests here, and then I'll maybe suggest where she could have gone. So the first thing that Cigman does is draw a distinction between the concept of persons and the concept of human beings. The concept of persons she refers to as this sort of purely moral concept, right? And the concept of human being as a sort of biological concept. So a human being is a member of the species Homo sapiens, right? Whereas a person is somebody sort of who has certain kinds of rights and should be, regarded as a kind of moral agent in that sense, right? And so she says this about human beings. She says, it seems reasonable to suggest that the reason why most human beings, right? No, she says most here, right? Used in the biological sense, have the right to life is related to the fact that death is regarded as possibly a grave misfortune for a human being. Right. So by and large, right, your standard adult human being really can conceptualize death in a certain way, in a way that's necessary for death to be a grave misfortune for them. And that's the reason why she says most, right? She does say most human beings have this right not to be killed, right? But she continues, she says the concept of capacity in this context has not been examined. I have not tried to deal with the various ways in which a person may be said to possess an unrealized capacity to be a subject of the misfortune of death. Many awkward cases may be brought up in this connection. One of the incurably comatose, fetuses, newborn infants. To discuss such cases and attempt to specify with precision what is meant by capacity would be beyond the scope of this paper. And again, I feel like I don't think it's unfair to say that she's sort of dodging the marginal cases argument here. It may well be. I mean, certainly it's fair to write a paper where you're like, yes, I realize the marginal cases argument is a really huge part of this view, and I'm just not going to deal with it here. I guess that's fair. I wish she had really dealt with it here, because I think the account is largely incomplete without a more more stringent look at the marginal cases argument. Let's look at a couple of the other things she says about persons before sort of circling around and making some suggestions about what kinds of positions are available to Cigman here. She writes sort of right after some of these paragraphs, she says, I have suggested by contrast that no non-human is even a candidate for the right to life. This should be qualified at this point with a distinction between those non-humans, for example mice, of which it might be said that this is a logical impossibility given the primitiveness of their behavior, and those non-humans of which this cannot quite be said. Chimpanzees and dolphins, for example, are often cited as potential or even actual language users, and it is not absurd to suggest that these might turn out to qualify as persons in the purely moral sense. I have serious doubts about this possibility, as I think anyone must who understands the conceptual complexity surrounding our awareness of death. But it is not to be denied that where a small number of unusually sophisticated animals are concerned, the final answer may lie with a critical empirical investigation. Right. So one thing I want to say is here, I do think she could say a lot more about the marginal cases argument. It's in some sense dodging it. But what we have here are at least the pieces of outlining at least one potential approach to the marginal cases argument. Right. So it seems like what Cigman has allowed is a kind of spectrum, right, where the kinds of beings that that really do have this, who really can conceptualize death, are the kinds of beings for which death is a serious misfortune, and that means that everybody has a duty not to inflict that misfortune, again, all other things being equal. And so it may well be that at least some non-human animals rise to that level. And if they do, which he says that's an empirical matter, right? That's a matter of really careful investigation. Then they, again, if they have those sorts of, then at least those animals have those sorts of rights with respect to human beings. Contrariwise, at least some human beings seem to, as she says, have an unrealized capacity, right, to be the subject of the misfortune of death. So you might think of something like infants or children in this category, where or the comatose, who might sort of regain, right, the ability to for death to be a tragedy for them, or children who may eventually gain the ability to conceptualize death as a tragedy. And so maybe there's some arguments from potential, and again, that's not a completely problem-free area and there's lots of literature on that, but certainly that's an available position. But honestly, I think that it's possible that Cigman might simply bite the bullet on the marginal cases argument and say things like, well, look, strictly speaking, even though it sort of offends our sensibilities, there are certain, things that say, for example, infants and young children, or the senile, etc., it really cannot conceptualize as a tragedy, and so, cannot really be a duty that we have toward them. And I think if you go back to the example about, say, for example, mockery, I don't know. I think I know plenty of young parents who've said some things to their infants who will not stop crying or sleeping through the night that you wouldn't ever say to an adult human being, and they only say them because they know the infant cannot understand them, right? They might call them unholy little tyrants or something like that, just out of pure frustration. Again, knowing that the infant's just incapable of conceptualizing that as an insult. In fact, infants are, as far as we can tell, not capable of conceptualizing insults at all, much like our cats and dogs. Um, so the idea is that, again, you maybe have no duty not to insult an infant, given that they have no concept of an insult. Once they do have that concept, well, then it becomes wrong to insult them, and only then. I think, again, I don't know if Cigman would really go that way, but it certainly is an available option. And it certainly would require us to rethink a lot of the common ways that we sort of, divide things up. We tend to divide things up in a kind of essentialist way where, look, all humans have these sorts of rights, all non-humans don't have these kinds of rights, where again, if you take a look at this idea of capacities, I think you might end up having to simply bite the bullet on the marginal cases argument and just grant that there are some duties that we lack to at least some humans, and that we do have to at least some animals. And so it's a very interesting possibility. But again, there's not a lot here, and I do wish there was a bit more that might address that possibility. And so, finally, Cigman wants to address the issue that she says has mostly been a kind of background concern, right? And this is where, again, we want to say, all right, what kind of direct conflict, or how much rather direct conflict do we get between Cigman's piece here and Norcross's piece, even though there are some things that they are, at least it seems, fairly opposed to each other on. Where does Cigman stand on the question of vegetarianism? Right. Well, so here's what she says about it in the concluding section of the paper. She says that my argument, if successful, has pulled the carpet from under the vegetarian ideology, which seeks to protect animals from human jaws on the grounds of equal rights. This may reasonably be seen as a disappointing victory for someone who is trying to decide whether or not to eat meat. All it does is remove one argument for not eating meat. What is missing, it seems, is some criterion for deciding what kinds of human interests justify causing animals to suffer, or even to die a quick and painless death. So I think this is fair, right? She says, look, all I've really shown here is that if you shouldn't eat animals, it's not because they have equal rights to humans in all respects, right? She thinks that they do not, because they do not have equal capacities for conceptualizing certain things as misfortunes, and hence lack the ability to suffer those misfortunes. She continues, insofar as meat eating is found pleasurable, this pleasure is generally rooted in certain attitudes and traditions of long standing, which many people are understandably reluctant to give up. It would, of course, be conservative in the extreme to give much weight to these considerations. The question is whether they carry sufficient weight to justify what I've presented as the morally tolerable, though not insignificant activity of killing animals quickly and painlessly. Right? So again, if it's not, neither Norcross nor Cigman focus on the eating of the animals in and of itself. It's entirely a question of what we're justified in doing to the animals in order to eat them. Right? She does not tend to favor the idea that we can inflict suffering upon them, but does want to consider the idea that we might be justified in at least quickly and painlessly killing them in order to eat them. She concludes, my own view is that some such considerations, combined with the contingent fact that the nutritional value of meat is by no means proven to be negligible, successfully justify this activity. though the more usual phenomenon of causing animals to suffer as they are prepared for death is another matter. As long as such suffering persists, and to the extent that one is confident that meat is nutritionally dispensable, vegetarianism may well be the correct course. Right. So, given that this was written in 1981, I think that some of the data, right? I think vegetarianism was, certainly in the United States much less prevalent than it is today, and I think that it's fairly clear, or certainly clearer than it was in 1981, that that vegetarian diets can be perfectly nutritious, right? And so that I would be interested, right, to see if Cigman's view has changed on this particular facet, because she's like, so notice what she says here. She says, look, it may not be a tragedy, right? Death for a non-human animal may not actually consist in a tragedy, so we have no general duty, right, to not to kill them. But still, it seems like we have to have at least some good reason to kill them if we do. And that eating them may not actually even constitute a good enough reason. Right? And so there might be a lot less disagreement between Norcross's position and Cigman's position than it would otherwise indicate, given that they appear to be using two very different versions of the utilitarian moral theory, one qualitative and one quantitative. So it's again a tremendously interesting article, and we get two very subtly different and proposals here, and so what you want to do is sort of reflect, I think, on the degree to which Norcross and Cigman really do disagree, given that they are utilizing two fairly different moral approaches.